December 24, 1942. Near the dusty ridges of Tabourba Gap, Tunisia. The North African sun was sinking behind the Atlas Mountains when an eerie silence swept across the valley. American infantry crouched in the scrub, staring at the horizon where German armor moved like dark thunder. The earth trembled as panzer engines roared to life, steel treads grinding through sand and stone. For days, the men had watched those tanks roll through their lines like unstoppable giants. Rifles and grenades had done nothing. Even the heavy machine guns barely scratched the paint. But that evening, something new waited in the dirt, a weapon so strange that even its own soldiers didn't believe in it. Private William Barnes knelt behind a cluster of rocks, clutching a long metal tube no wider than his arm. It looked primitive, even laughable, a hollow pipe with two fins of wire trailing from its end. His squad had nicknamed it the stovepipe, and some had joked it was better suited for Christmas fireworks than war. The officers said it could kill a tank. The men doubted it. But they had no other choice. The panzers were closing in, and the air was shaking with the growl of approaching steel. The first German tank crested the ridge, its turret scanning the horizon. A second followed, then a third. Their gray hulls gleamed in the dying sunlight, confident, precise, unstoppable. The crews inside had learned to fear nothing the Americans carried. The Germans knew the M3 anti-tank gun could be outflanked, and bazooka or not, the Americans had no miracle weapon. Yet something different was unfolding, the stillness before an untested shot. Barnes steadied his hands, sighting the weapon's crude iron rail on the lead tank. The rocket was loaded, its fins trembling slightly. His loader whispered a quick prayer and ducked. Barnes exhaled. A hiss. A flash. The tube spat fire and smoke. The rocket streaked low across the desert and slammed into the panzer's side. A dull thud, then, silence. A heartbeat later, the tank erupted. The explosion threw black smoke into the sky, the turret lifting off its ring. The German crew spilled out, confused, screaming, one of them collapsing beside the burning hull. For a brief, stunned moment, both sides froze. The Americans couldn't believe it. A useless pipe had just killed a tank. The remaining panzers reversed, their commanders shouting over the radio in disbelief. Barnes reloaded, his hands trembling, sweat streaking his face beneath the helmet. When the second rocket whooshed away, it hit another tank square in the engine deck, blowing it apart in a burst of dust and flame. The line of steel that had once been invincible now burned in the valley. Word spread quickly through the American ranks. The stovepipe worked. The men who had doubted it moments before were now cheering, their voices carried by the wind. But beneath the excitement lay something else, realization. This was no accident. This new weapon, crude as it looked, had just rewritten the rules of infantry combat. The Germans were not slow to notice. Reports came in of mysterious rockets tearing through armor that had once been thought impenetrable. Field officers described the weapon as a small artillery tube, assuming it was an isolated invention. Some even dismissed the incident entirely, blaming poor tactics or ammunition storage. But by the following week, more tanks had fallen to these strange bursts of fire. The name bazooka began circulating through the American lines, borrowed from a comedian's musical contraption back home. Soldiers joked about it, but behind the laughter lay a new sense of power. For the first time, a foot soldier could destroy a tank alone. To the Germans, this was a humiliation. They had prided themselves on armored superiority, their panzers forming the spearhead of Blitzkrieg itself. Against British or Soviet guns, they had prevailed through speed and precision. But now, American infantrymen, green, undertrained, often frightened, had struck fear into the heart of the armored corps. The battlefield dynamic shifted. Infantry began moving with renewed courage, advancing where once they would have scattered. In the days that followed, at dusk and dawn, the deserts of Tunisia echoed with the sharp hiss of rockets. German crews grew paranoid, scanning ridgelines and gullies for the faint glint of a tube. Their commanders ordered armor units to keep distance from infantry zones, a tactical retreat disguised as caution. It was the beginning of a psychological war, a new kind of terror, silent until it screamed to life. Yet the bazooka was far from perfect. Its accuracy was fickle, and its rockets unreliable. Many failed to detonate, fizzing harmlessly into sand. Soldiers called them duds. Others misfired entirely, leaving trails of smoke that gave away positions. Still, in the desperate battles of Tunisia, even an imperfect miracle was enough. For the first time, ordinary men could look at an oncoming tank and think, we might stand a chance. Behind the front lines, engineers and ordnance men worked tirelessly to refine the weapon. They examined rocket casings warped by heat, adjusted propellant charges, and experimented with new warhead shapes. In workshops made of canvas and sandbags, they disassembled spent launchers and rebuilt them with salvaged parts. It was crude engineering under fire, but it worked. Each week, the weapon grew more dependable, more lethal. American commanders began to recognize the potential. Infantry units were now being supplied with bazookas in 2s and 3s. Platoons trained to coordinate their shots, learning to ambush tanks from gullies and ruins. Tactics shifted from retreat to resilience. The Germans had no idea how quickly this small weapon was multiplying. One German officer wrote in frustration that his tank crews were haunted by invisible guns carried by ghosts. Another noted how the Americans use a pipe that spits fire, and our armor bursts. By February 1943, entire panzer platoons hesitated to enter narrow passes. The myth of invincibility, the armored fist of the Reich, was cracking, one rocket at a time. But the story of the bazooka's rise was only beginning. What the soldiers at Taburba Gap didn't yet know was that their crude green tubes were part of a larger transformation. In hidden American factories, thousands more were being assembled, faster, lighter, deadlier. The engineers behind them were perfecting a new kind of shaped charge, capable of slicing through inches of hardened steel with focused fire. The weapon that had started as a laughingstock was about to become the backbone of American infantry firepower. And soon, in the next great battles of North Africa, the Germans would learn that what they once mocked as a toy was, in truth, a silent revolution. The useless pipe was about to change the face of warfare forever. In the months following the first shocking engagements at Taburba, the weapon once dismissed as a toy began its transformation into a battlefield legend. Behind the lines, American ordnance engineers and factory workers pored over test data, field reports, and shattered fragments of German armor. What they discovered would redefine the science of anti-tank warfare. The secret wasn't brute force, it was geometry. The bazooka's shaped charge warhead didn't rely on speed or weight, it focused explosive energy into a single molten jet, burning through armor like a welding torch in reverse. The men at Aberdeen Proving Ground called it chemical penetration. To the soldiers who fired it, it was simply power in their hands. The weapon's name, bazooka, came from a comedian's odd brass instrument back home, but the design owed more to engineering than showmanship. Built around the M6 rocket, the launcher was a 54-inch smoothbore tube with a firing battery and simple wire sights. Its warhead carried a conical copper liner designed to collapse inward on detonation, focusing pressure into a narrow point. The result was a jet hot enough to punch through nearly 3 inches of steel. That meant even the Panzer III's front armor, once untouchable, was now vulnerable if hit squarely. Soldiers trained to aim for side panels, engine decks, and turrets. The soft spots were steel met design limits. By January 1943, as the Allies regrouped in Tunisia, shipments of the M1A1 bazooka were flowing across the Atlantic. Each launcher weighed barely 13 pounds and could be carried by one man, though doctrine required a two-man team, a gunner and a loader. In field manuals, it was listed as an infantry anti-tank rocket launcher, but to the men on the ground it became a symbol of survival. They called themselves tank hunters, a dangerous pride earned through sweat and fire. The Germans, meanwhile, were analyzing the wreckage. At a forward maintenance camp near Kasserine, technicians examined the punctured hull of a destroyed Panzer and realized the blast pattern didn't match any shell or mine. The hole was clean, cone-shaped, and slightly glazed. Their reports described it as the effect of a high-velocity shaped charge. But they couldn't explain how such a weapon could be fired from the shoulder. To them, it seemed impossible, until captured American weapons began to arrive. German intelligence officers held the strange tubes in their hands, turning them over in disbelief. The word bazooka appeared on stenciled crates, followed by a rocket launcher, M1A1. The Germans quickly began developing their own version, a heavier, more powerful copy known as the Panzerschreck or Tank Terror. Ironically, the weapon they once mocked now inspired them. But by the time their engineers perfected it, the Americans were already deploying improved models. The arms race of innovation had begun. In Tunisia's rocky valleys, the first large-scale test of the bazooka's effectiveness came in February 1943, the Battle of Kasserine Pass. It was the U.S. Army's baptism by fire against Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's seasoned Afrika Corps. The Americans, inexperienced and spread thin, faced a brutal assault from German armor and artillery. Early on the morning of February 19, the thunder of tank engines rolled through the pass. Dust clouds rose like storm fronts. Infantry scrambled for cover as shells exploded across the ridge lines. Among them, in the 26th Infantry Regiment, Sergeant James Lawton and his loader Corporal Miles took position near a narrow defile. They carried one of the newer M1A1 bazookas, its battery freshly fitted, its rockets warmed near the fire to prevent misfires. The ground trembled as Panzer IVs advanced through the gap. German machine guns ripped across the slope, cutting down brush and men alike. Lawton steadied his launcher. Miles slid in the rocket. When the tank came into view, its gray hull blotting out the horizon, Lawton fired. The rocket shrieked across the open pass and struck the turret's side with a flash. A second later, fire burst from the hatch. The blast halted the German column. Smoke poured into the pass. American riflemen cheered, briefly, before artillery fire rained down in reply. The battle raged for hours, chaotic and unforgiving. Yet through the smoke, more bazookas fired, their white trails streaking like comets. Several tanks were hit, others damaged, forcing the Germans to maneuver more cautiously. What had begun as a rout became a slugging match. For the Germans, it was disorienting. They had expected to roll through American lines as they had the French months before. Instead, they faced ambushes where infantry melted into the rocks, firing invisible rockets that struck with terrifying precision. German after-action notes described infantry with portable tubes launching fire bolts capable of penetrating armor. Crews reported panic as they tried to identify threats hidden in dust and shadow. The psychological impact was immense. Every bush or ruin might conceal a man with a weapon that could end them in seconds. Behind this battlefield chaos was a network of quiet geniuses, American engineers and factory laborers who had turned theory into survival. Edward Ewell, a young engineer from the Army Ordnance Department, had designed the launcher itself, while Dr. Clarence Hickman at the National Defense Research Committee had refined the rocket stabilization system. Together, they produced a weapon that could be built cheaply and used by anyone. In Detroit and Chicago, factory workers, many of them women, assembled launchers on long wooden tables, testing each ignition wire by hand. Every one of those weapons carried the fingerprints of those who had never seen battle, but who shaped its outcome nonetheless. As the Battle of Kasserine waned, the lessons became clear. The bazooka couldn't win battles alone, it needed discipline, teamwork, and courage. Misfires were still common, the rockets were fragile, and the batteries unreliable in desert heat. But when it worked, it changed everything. Infantrymen learned to strike from flanks, from gullies and behind wrecks, using the terrain to close within 100 yards before firing. For the first time since the war began, infantry no longer felt like prey before the armored divisions. In one engagement near Thala, a German tank platoon advancing through a wadi was ambushed by a small American detachment armed with bazookas. 4 rockets, 4 hits, 3 tanks destroyed, 1 crippled. The rest retreated in confusion. German officers later recorded that their armor could no longer advance without infantry protection. That single sentence marked a shift in doctrine. The balance between tank and man had tilted. By spring 1943, as the Allies prepared to push toward Bizerta and Tunis, the once doubted bazooka was now standard issue across American divisions. Field commanders requested more with every convoy. Crews named their launchers, decorating them with chalk drawings and jokes. The useless pipe had become the soldier's best friend, a symbol of ingenuity born from desperation. And yet, behind the triumph, the weapon's full potential remained untapped. Engineers were already sketching new variants, lighter tubes, stronger batteries, warheads capable of piercing even thicker armor. The arms factories in the United States buzzed with innovation, their machines humming day and night. What had begun as a desperate experiment was evolving into a family of weapons that would soon spread across the world. But before that evolution could take shape, the bazooka would face its greatest test, the battlefields of Europe. There, amid hedgerows, snow, and ruins, it would not only destroy tanks but shape morale, strategy, and the very psychology of war. By the summer of 1943, as the desert winds of North Africa quieted and Allied troops prepared to invade Sicily, the bazooka had already earned a place in history. What began as a crude, doubted invention had transformed the very rhythm of battle. Soldiers carried it like a promise that no tank, no matter how monstrous, could dominate unchecked. The weapon's psychological weight was immense. It gave infantrymen something more than firepower, it gave them belief. For the first time since the war began, they no longer saw tanks as invincible. That shift, invisible yet powerful, rippled across every front. German officers noticed it too. Reports filtered back to Berlin describing American rocket tubes that allow the enemy to attack armor at close range. Crews began welding spare track links and sandbags to their hulls, desperate to counter a weapon that seemed to melt steel. It was the first time in the war that the mere possibility of encountering a handheld anti-tank weapon dictated movement. Tank commanders changed tactics, keeping infantry close and avoiding tight terrain. The blitzkrieg rhythm, speed, surprise, encirclement, began to slow. One tube had rewritten doctrine. The bazooka's story was not just one of engineering, but of adaptation. Each battlefield became a test range. In Sicily, American and British troops learned to use the weapon against concrete bunkers and machine gun nests, finding that its shaped charge could shatter walls and pillboxes. In Italy, the steep terrain of Monte Cassino turned it into an anti-fortification tool, blasting open stone positions that artillery couldn't reach. Soldiers improvised, modifying rockets with extra explosive filler or rigging the launchers onto jeeps for mobile assaults. Necessity, once again, became the mother of innovation. The engineers back home followed every report. In laboratories from New Jersey to California, they examined fragments returned from battlefields, testing new metals and ignition systems. They knew the Germans had begun producing their own copy, the Panzerschreck, and they intended to stay ahead. The American M9, a newer version with a two-piece tube and improved sighting, was born from that urgency. It fired a 3.5-pound rocket capable of punching through nearly 4 inches of armor. By the time of D-Day, thousands were waiting in crates aboard ships bound for Normandy. When Allied forces landed on the beaches of France on June 6, 1944, the bazooka was in nearly every infantry platoon. Amid the chaos of machine gun fire and artillery, men fired rockets at concrete bunkers guarding the coast. The explosions tore open firing ports, silencing nests that had pinned down entire companies. As the campaign pushed inland, hedgerows became ambush zones. Small teams hid beneath the thick greenery, waiting for German tanks to rumble by. When they did, the flash of a bazooka cut through the hedgerow shadows, and another steel beast burned. Yet the weapon's impact was not measured only in kills. It was measured in fear, the fear it instilled in German armor crews who had once felt untouchable. The bazooka turned the battlefield into a hunting ground. The hunter was no longer the tank, but the man crouched in the mud with a green tube on his shoulder. Every shell hole, every ruined house, every ditch became a possible death trap for armor. This shift forced German doctrine to evolve mid-war, compelling them to divert resources toward countermeasures, heavier armor, protective skirts, and infrared detection equipment. But no matter how thick the plates became, somewhere a new warhead was being forged to match it. The psychological divide grew wider. Allied troops, emboldened by this balance of power, pressed forward with renewed aggression. Veterans later spoke of the bazooka not as a mere weapon, but as a faith in metal. It was light enough for one man, powerful enough to halt a tank, and simple enough to repair in the field. That simplicity was by design. Edward Yuill and Clarence Hickman had insisted that the weapon be soldier-proof, easy to assemble, harder to misuse. It worked in mud, in snow, in the choking dust of deserts. It was the everyman's cannon, the weapon of the ordinary soldier against the machine age. As the Allies advanced into Germany, the weapon evolved further. Bazooka teams began operating in coordinated squads, striking tanks from multiple directions to ensure at least one hit. Infantry manuals taught ambush tactics specifically built around the weapon's use. And on the Eastern Front, Soviet engineers, having received samples through Lend-Lease, developed their own versions, the RPG family that would define warfare for decades to come. When the war ended, the numbers told a staggering story. Tens of thousands of bazookas had been produced, millions of rockets fired. They had destroyed or disabled countless enemy tanks, bunkers, and vehicles across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. But beyond the raw statistics lay a deeper truth, that the bazooka had redefined warfare itself. For centuries, heavy armor had dominated the battlefield. Now, power had shifted back to the individual. A soldier with courage and a single rocket could change the outcome of an engagement. The weapon's influence didn't end with the war. In the Korean conflict, its descendants, the M20 Super Bazooka and later rocket launchers, faced Soviet-made T-34s in the mountains of the peninsula. In Vietnam, the same core principle, the shaped charge, evolved into the M72 law. Across the Cold War, that idea, portable anti-armor firepower, became a cornerstone of infantry design worldwide. What began as a crude tube in the hands of frightened soldiers in Tunisia had become a symbol of the modern battlefield. But perhaps its greatest legacy was not technical, but human. The bazooka represented the ingenuity of engineers and the courage of soldiers, a fusion of science and sacrifice. It was born in workshops, perfected in deserts, and immortalized in the fields of Europe. It reminded the world that innovation often starts with doubt, and victory often begins with those willing to trust in something unproven. In interviews decades later, veterans still remembered the weapon's hiss, the smell of burnt propellant, the sight of a tank erupting in flame. Some spoke of fear, others spoke of pride. But all agreed on one thing: it gave them hope. In a war defined by machines, it restored a sense of balance, man against metal, courage against might. When a reporter once asked an aging engineer what he thought of his invention's place in history, he paused and smiled. "We gave the ordinary soldier a chance," he said quietly. And sometimes, that's all history needs. From the sands of Tunisia to the snow of Ardennes, from makeshift test sites to the assembly lines back home, the bazooka was more than a weapon. It was a declaration that ingenuity could level the battlefield, that courage could light a spark against overwhelming odds. And when that first rocket whooshed out of its green tube and struck steel in the African dusk, the world changed. In that instant, a new age of warfare began, one where the powerless found their fire, and a so-called useless pipe became the weapon that humbled giants.